Thank you for coming, Naomi. Welcome to Barrie, Vermont.
So the whole crowd is here, Naomi. Thank you very much for coming. And we're ready whenever you are.
Great.
I'm ready. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Why don't you tell Naomi something about where we are in the old labor hall?
Yeah, so I'm going to direct this back my way. So, Naomi, we're in the old socialist labor hall in Barrie, Vermont. And it's a really great place to be here today. We've got about 25 people who have read your book over the past 4 months throughout the state. We've had about 25 book groups, and it's people who have finished the book, read it twice, or are still reading it. So thank you very much. And unless there are any other questions, I will start with our first question asker. All right, thank you again.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us here today. I'm Brian Tokar. I'm a board member of 350 Vermont and have also been writing about some of these same issues for quite a long time. Just a couple of sentences of lead up and then a two-part question. So in several parts of your book, you suggest that what we need the most are reforms to the energy system and an end to neoliberal economics and a revival of the public sector of the economy. In the concluding chapters and in some recent interviews, I think you go a step further and suggest that we need an entirely different economic system. And I appreciate your preference to avoid laying out a blueprint for the latter, as we all know the future is unpredictable. So what do you view as the most helpful steps toward transforming the economy beyond capitalism? And do you see any hopeful signs that the various movements that you described so well in the third part of the book can join together to make a more unified whole?
Okay. That's a great question, and I think that I want Brian to be able to put a face to the name. I've been doing your work for a really long time. I'm getting a really strong echo here. Any advice on how I can
just mute your sound on your end.
Mute the sound on mine.
Yep, so that you can't hear us until you're done talking. Try that.
Mute the sound on my end. So I have a mute button that would mute me. How do I mute you?
Or just turn your volume down if you're on a Mac.
Mute our side, it might do it.
All right. So just nod if everything's okay on your end, Brian. Okay, great. Yeah. So you know the critique of capitalism in the book is a sort of a two-tier argument, right? Which is like that the critique of neoliberalism explains, I think, in large part why we've had this terrible timing and why the policies that would have made sense in the 90s were totally anathema but you know, fairly early on in the book, I make the case that because we failed and we now need to be cutting our emissions by 8 to 10% a year, climate change presents a challenge not just to neoliberalism, but to the growth imperative at the heart of capitalism. And so in terms of, in terms of, laying out the blueprint and so on, it's the future is uncertain, but I think it's more than that. I've never seen that as my role as a writer to sort of, prescribe formulas, but in large part because I think that should be a democratic process that is owned by social movements. And so and I think that the tricky part is not that we don't know what the sort of policies we need to fight for are. It's that the triumph of neoliberalism has been so complete that we really lack the institutions that can bring us together to articulate the demands and just to fight for that change, right? we don't have the political parties in most places, although that's starting to change. Unions are so severely under attack that all they're doing for the most part is just fighting the latest round of layoffs, as opposed to creating spaces as they have in the past to put forward a visionary agenda. So I guess I would answer that question by telling you something that I'm involved in here in Canada, which is an attempt to bring together the different constituencies that clearly need to be at the table in articulating the principles of this transition and fighting for it. So to me, that's the climate justice movement, the labor movement, racial justice movement. In Canada, it's really critical that First Nations be at the center of this, that Indigenous people be at the center, and you could name like the student movement, the feminist movement. So because we don't see this happening, we're convening a meeting. The sort of This Changes Everything team, which is really not equipped to do this, but we're doing it anyway. And we've got some of the key unions on board, including Unifor, which is the largest private sector union that represents energy workers and auto workers in Canada. And we're holding a meeting in May. It's a two-day workshop, basically, to try to articulate the principles, and that would be things like, maybe 100% renewable energy, decentralized, community controlled and run by 2030, free public transit, an expansion of, the public sector that's already low carbon. We're going to have a big fight about whether one of the principles includes leaving tar sands in the ground, because that language is really, really hard for the labor movement to get behind. But we're going to try, and we're going to see what happens when we get in the room together. And I mean, one of the things we're really hoping about this meeting is that it will create it'll create a reference point for Canada, which we need in an election year, but also that this will be maybe something that will be useful in other countries. And particularly, I mean, obviously, I think it's really critical in the United States ahead of the election that there be a really clear vision for what climate justice looks like, because the candidates are going to be a disaster, and there's a real chance of backsliding from an already unacceptable place. So we want to create something that is something that could be just a reference point and is used in the political process. We're also hoping it could be useful ahead of the climate summit in Paris. And in terms of your question of examples of this happening, like I would point to ATTAC in France, which is trying ahead of Paris, the climate summit in Paris, to bring together these various constituencies, and they have a strong history of that kind of coalition work. And they're at the center of the fights against free trade, the fights for a financial transaction tax. They have strong connections with the farmers' movements, with the peasant movements in France. So they are convening a series of meetings that they call Alternativas ahead of the Paris COP. So it's very much this kind of two-prong rejection of the false solutions that are going to be coming out of the COP and the inadequate ambition out of the COP. But it isn't just about not having targets that are strong enough. It's also that they're going to be pushing nuclear as a solution. They're going to be pushing big dams. France is home. France. It's a real problem that France is hosting this summit, because more than 70% of France's energy comes from nuclear, and it's home base for some of the most insidious and largest private water companies like Suez. Very powerful agribusiness companies as well. So it's really not enough to ask for climate action. We can't let the UN define what we mean by climate action. We have to be clear on what we want and what we mean by climate justice. I missed what Brian just said.
Sorry, I had it
Oh,
muted.
I said I'd love to follow up, but I'll leave that to my other friends in the room.
Can you turn the light back on for?
Oh, that's okay.
Which is where?
It's okay. Can you see Naomi? Can you see? Can you see us on our end, Naomi?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I am going to be asking a question for Sharon Rakusin from Norwich, Vermont, who can't be here today. And we just wanted to note that there's going to be about 10 questions, so hopefully we'll try and get all of those in. But Sharon asks, when you spoke with May Bove in February 2015, you talked about your obsession and mine about how activists are not able to break out of their respective issue silos. And she provided a quote. My personal obsession is that I feel like there's this way in which we are still failing to break out of our respective issue silos. There are people who are working on climate where that doesn't intersect nearly enough with the people working for the public sphere, fighting for the commons, fighting against austerity, even when it's the same people. They put on their climate hat and they're being one person, and then they put on their no cuts hat or their anti-austerity hat, and it somehow doesn't become the same conversation, even when we intellectually understand it as the same. Her question is, how would you envision this happening, and why must we fight common ground to work together for our human rights to live with dignity and health?
Yeah. So this builds, I think, really naturally on the last question, and I think there are some good examples of attempts to do this, to build these coalitions. I mean, it's not happening fast enough, given the urgency, but there's some interesting stuff happening in the UK right now. I think in the book I mentioned, I have their brochure right here, which is this. It comes out of a section of the TUC in the UK. I don't know if you can read this. This is the 1 million climate jobs, just very short pamphlet, really accessible. I mean, I think it's a good document. I think it's still in that it's putting jobs at the center. But I mean, I wouldn't endorse it 100% in the sense that it's still very much on a growth framework. It's sort of like, we need these jobs because then there will be more consumption and that'll fuel the economy and economic growth. So, I think there's still issues to struggle with there. But you have that happening in the UK, and then you also have a really strong campaign against energy poverty that links the need for renewable energy. So, I mean, right now there's a crisis of people not being able to afford energy in the UK, and so they've developed this. It's called the Energy Bill of Rights, that includes the right to clean energy, but also the right to affordable energy. So it's this rights-based framework, which I think is really helpful. And I think because you have these building blocks of different groups that have been working on this for a while and thinking about how you have these intersections, there's gonna be a, I think it's in June, there's a big convergence and march and thing in the UK, and it's under the banner of jobs, justice, and climate. And it's the largest scale coalition I've seen of labor and climate, and that will also be important in terms of preparing for Paris. One of my disappointments was what's going on in Europe right now, where you have political parties like Syriza that just took power in Greece. And I think they're really missing an opportunity to connect the rejection of austerity with a climate justice agenda, and are continuing down an extractivist path. It seems there's quite a lot of concern about this around coal mining and oil drilling, and it's not clear the extent to which they're going to keep their word, and in the book I talk about this very controversial gold mine in northern Greece, and they had promised that if they were elected, one of their first acts would be to kill that project, and it's not clear whether they're going to do that. So I think there is tremendous potential with a party like Syriza, the fact that in Spain, Podemos is very high in the polls, where you have, the anti-austerity forces really gaining strength. But I would be lying if I told you that I'm, seeing the connections that need to be made between the austerity fight and the climate fight. And, Pablo Iglesias, who's the leader of Podemos and is a really, really interesting guy and a new, sort of a new kind of leader, recently said something like, people can't care about climate change when they're worried about putting food on the table. So they're still not making the connection of, it's not about waiting till the economic crisis and then caring about climate change. It's that can be a catalyst to solve the economic crisis with a better economic system. And that, I think people get that at the grassroots, but I'm not seeing it at the leadership level yet.
Hi, Naomi. I'm Harris Webster from Montpelier, Vermont. I start off with a confession. I've just started your book. I haven't finished it. I got the first chapter. At the climate march, I was impressed how climate change was an umbrella for many, many movements. And so my question involves one of those movements. I assume you are familiar with the commons concept and movement. How are your ideas and views and analysis similar to or different from what proponents of the commons approach advocate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, and it's something that I get into somewhat in the book. I don't get into it in huge depth, but I think that if we look at this movement that is increasingly being called energy democracy, right, where it is about moving to renewables, but not just sort of flipping the switch from one kind of power, from fossil fuels to that are owned and controlled by large companies or unaccountable public utilities, and then just trying to have the same model but switching it over to renewables, but really trying to have a far more democratic energy system that is, I think, on the commons model, where it is sort of a different figure of ownership that is not sort of either state-owned or corporate controlled, but is genuinely community-owned and controlled energy. And that's a part of the German energy transition. It's not the only aspect of it. I mean, there are big private players, there are big state players, but there are also huge numbers of community-owned and controlled energy projects that have proliferated, and I think we're seeing some of the same around land ownership and water that are a key part of this transition. Yeah.
He said thank you. Sorry, I had it muted.
Hi, Naomi. This is Maeve McBride. I run the state chapter of 350 Vermont. I'm asking for somebody else, though, a participant in the Upper Valley. And this person is asking about, why did you not address methane from farm animals in your book, in one participant's opinion? For example, cutting down the rainforest to make room for more cattle. And then the follow-up is that, how are Indigenous people linked, and do you see them as a global movement? I assume she's referring to the Indigenous people. She or he.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Somebody repeat the question. That was not hearable.
Oh, sure. Why did you not address methane from farm animals in the book? And how are the Indigenous people linked? And does Naomi see them as a global movement?
Yeah. I definitely think there could have been more in the book about agriculture generally. There is a little bit in the book about the need to shift to agroecological farming methods, and the huge body of research that exists that shows that that model is our best hope of lowering emissions and fighting inequality at the same time, and discusses the emissions related to industrial agriculture as a whole, not just animal agriculture. A lot of this is coming out because of a film called Farmageddon, and I would just say that people should get multiple sources on the emissions cited in that film, because there's actually a lot of disagreement about what percentage of our emissions come from animal agriculture, but there's no doubt that industrial animal agriculture is a big contributor to climate change. We've known this for a long time, and the benefit of something like agroecology is that it has much better land use. It also includes farming methods that don't require deforestation, but it isn't a cookie cutter approach in the sense that it isn't like a formula where it's the same agricultural model everywhere. It is a model that specifically says that agriculture should look different everywhere, because it should be adapted to its place, and also to local knowledge, and particular indigenous knowledge. Then the second part of the question is about indigenous people, and are they linked? I mean, obviously there's a global movement of indigenous people that is linked in many different ways, including through the United Nations, and that movement has produced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There are regular summits and so on, I'll just leave it at that.
Question 5.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Arthur Blackhawk, and I'm with the Burlington Reading Group. I live in Essex Junction, Vermont. I'm probably one of the collaborations and processes. I'm a state union member as well as an environmentalist, so I come from many causes into the same pool. My question, though, has to do in part with media, and the fact that much of our media today is controlled by big business. Last time I saw you, you were in Washington with Bill, and we were circling the White House. And what was interesting was being there and witnessing that event, and then coming home and seeing the news coverage of what took place was very different. Last week, I was involved in an austerity march here in our capital. And what I saw on the news when I got home, having experienced the march, was very, very different. And so my question to you is, there it is, sorry. How do we challenge the 1% that controls the media and sends their message of fear out, that basically distorts and holds control of that kind of focus on the mass, and deny the fee at the root cause of the other 99%, the human need piece?
Well, I mean, it's a huge issue. Yeah, I mean, I remember my own frustration that the civil disobedience was barely covered, in the U.S. media. It was really striking that MSNBC pretty much ignored a lot of this. It's gotten a little bit better. Obviously, one of the influences, in addition to that network being so incredibly pro-Obama, is the fact that they were being blanketed with pro-pipeline ads at that time. And every time you watched anything on MSNBC in this period, you got like an Exxon ad, talking about how great the tar sands were. It certainly highlights how important, our independent media is, and also how important social media is, because what's striking, despite being ignored, by the corporate press. This movement is growing incredibly quickly. But yeah, I was going to say the People's Climate March in September, 400,000 people on the streets of New York in, the front yards of all the major, media outlets. And it was, not completely ignored, but, I think that the significance of that event was really downplayed, and, it didn't have any legs. It was out of the news within 2 days, right? And I say at the start of the book that it's not just politicians who can declare a crisis, regular people can as well. And I do think that it's not enough to simply, build our own media structures, though we do have to do that. I think we also need to have strategies to go after the corporate press and call them out on failing to do their jobs on such a pressing issue. Because one would like to say, well, we just have to build a movement that's too big to ignore. But when 400,000 people march in New York City and that can still virtually be ignored or get better coverage outside the United States, which is actually what happened with the People's Climate March, then obviously it's a huge problem. So I do think there needs to be this kind of strategy that is often used, I've seen used in other countries where the press is really called out. I mean, it's really, it's one of the targets of our activism is the press. Even, fairness and accuracy in reporting just did a piece on how striking it is that the major networks and cable news, when they're covering the California drought, which they can't ignore because it's such a huge story, are overwhelmingly, not invariably, but overwhelmingly failing to talk about climate change, right? So I think that that's a really good target in the sense of, I think marshaling climate scientists and, launching campaigns that targets media coverage specifically saying, we demand that you talk about climate change, California drought. It's misleading to fail to make that connection. I guess that's just one example. For those of you who haven't read it, the Guardian newspaper has been in the midst of this really interesting campaign where I guess it was like about a month and a half ago, Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, kicked off this campaign of coverage of climate change. He's been editor of The Guardian for 20 years, and he's leaving the paper in June. And he wrote this essay about how, looking back at his 20 years of being editor of The Guardian, he asked himself whether he had any regrets. And he realized that his one regret is that he feels that the paper did not do an adequate job of covering what may be the biggest story never told, which is the fact that we need to keep about 3/4 of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And so they've launched this campaign. So one of the things that I think can be done is, like, people should send that essay by Alan to editors of their local newspapers, because one of the things that I've seen is that, like, in Europe, for instance, it's already having an impact. The fact that the Guardian's editor is saying, if our politicians won't treat this like an emergency, we will, and we will put it on the front page again and again. And so I think, sending that essay, asking for a response, writing op-eds about it, just putting it on the radar in the United States, because that's real leadership coming from an influential person in the media. And sometimes it's a little bit easier for a journalist to hear from other journalists. And Alan is a really respected journalist. Under his leadership, they broke the Snowden story, they worked with WikiLeaks, they broke phone hacking. This is a guy who is really respected. And the other thing is that The Guardian is trying to expand its US presence. I think having a greater presence for The Guardian in the US media landscape could help too.
Thank you for your book and being a voice in the change.
Thank you.
Hi, Naomi. I'm Arthur Hines on the 350 Vermont board. And I'm interested in the depths of corporate planning and strategy in fighting the climate movement. In the cap and trade fiasco, you talk about how the fossil fuel industry and supporters sabotaged the legislation they helped write, and it died in the Senate. And I quote, but not before it discredited the very idea of climate action in the minds of many. Do you think the discrediting was actually part of the strategy, or how deep does their long-range strategizing and contingency plans go? I mean, how far ahead and how complex, are their reactions to the climate movement, going?
Well, I think they're very complex and non-linear. I mean, I think this is an industry that really covers all of its bases, right? So, at the same time as, they're funding denial, they're funding, the sort of overt attacks on the climate movement. They're also, in some cases, funding the climate movement, right? And, making sure that, doing their best to make sure that, that if this, if they don't win in, their efforts to get no legislation, that the legislation that will emerge will be so weak that they can survive it. And I think we're starting to see some of that with this kind of we can live with a carbon tax of some kind, putting a price on carbon. You hear that now more from some of the big fossil fuel companies. And that's a reason for concern, because if that's the case, they're going to make sure that the price is so low, or that the tax is so low that it will be totally inadequate, and that huge amounts of energy will go into fighting for a really inadequate response. I think the good news is that there is a new generation of climate activists who absolutely know who their enemy is. The most, I think, exciting part of this incredible proliferation of the divestment movement, and we just saw, this amazing week of action in New England, and where, students at Harvard were, occupying their various parts of the university, blockading the entrance to Mass Hall for an entire week. You had the alumni association office occupied by various alumni, including one Bill McKibben. But I think the really significant part of that is that there was all of this blurriness about, is the solution going to come from the fossil fuel companies? Can we find a win-win? And, young people today know that that's just not possible, right? So I think that this new wave of activism that we're seeing is just a lot harder to buy off. And, I would say that that's certainly true of the anti-fracking movement as well. And in many cases, it's leaving these sort of old school green groups behind, right? Where if you look at a situation like New York State's anti-fracking, the fracking ban that went through a few months ago, or just 2 months ago, what was really striking about that is that you had groups like EDF that were trying to sort of carve out this sort of center, let's split the difference between those radical anti-frackers and Cuomo, and we're going to be the ones that just want, regulation of fracking. And then lo and behold, they get left behind because Cuomo comes out against fracking, and they look completely irrelevant. They're to the right of Cuomo on this, and that's no good. And, their members are seeing this. So I just actually feel really optimistic, about the fact that there's a real shift going on. And I did devote a lot of time in my book to going after some of the groups that I think I got it disastrously wrong. But I think in the scheme of things now, this new movement is really eclipsing that. Not to say that they're not still doing damage, they are, and there are still problems. I think the fact that Michael Bloomberg gets to be a climate hero because he's funding Sierra Club to shut down coal plants at the same time as he's trying to undermine the fracking ban in New York, and he's personally invested in oil and gas infrastructure on a huge scale, is really unacceptable.
Thanks.
Hi, Naomi. My name is Jeff Farber. I live in Montpelier. I'm an independent filmmaker. And I'll preface my question by saying I think you were very courageous in writing your book by taking a step back from the skirmishes on the earth and looking at this from a broader perspective of humans within the total biosphere. And it's not very often that people who are talking about this take that step back. And I'm just going to reference one sentence where you did that, and that kind of leads into my question. So you're talking about Watt and the progress of industrialization, and you say, because to confront the crisis truthfully is to confront ourselves, to reckon as our ancestors did with our vulnerability to the elements that make up both the planet and our bodies. It is to accept, even embrace, being but one porous part of the world rather than its master or machinist, as Bacon long ago promised. So I think that's a great sentence that's in this great book. And my question is, progress, as used by the industrialist, is a human coined term that describes an infinite linear growth that is used to justify and glorify both industrial technology and economic development, yet there is no progress in the universe. Without deconstructing this notion of unending economic growth in the guise of progress, can we really undermine the forces propelling climate change? And by progress, I'm not talking about someone who doesn't have water and now has clean water, who is starving and now has food. I'm talking about progress in the much larger capitalist industrial sense.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I have to say on a personal level, that those are the parts of the book that interest me most and that I'm sort of most interested in pursuing in the future, and actually, honestly, that I find kind of resonate most with people. I've been really interested at how receptive people are to this idea of climate change being a kind of a spiritual crisis, being this expression of this failed story, this failed narrative that puts us apart from nature. And I think that that those parts of the research, particularly the work of Andreas Malm, the Swedish historian who I cite quite a bit, it's so interesting to go back and look at the way coal was marketed as being, this is your escape from nature, and so I do believe that challenging growth is central to this, and challenging this notion of progress. Ronald Wright has written really, brilliantly. Those of you who don't know, A Short History of Progress by Ronald Wright. It's a series of essays. It's actually a series of lectures he gave, and it's a great little critique of that idea of progress. A documentary film was made of it that is kind of less useful than the essays, but I would really recommend it. But that said, like, I have my concerns about the degrowth movement. There's a fairly strong degrowth movement, and it's particularly strong in Europe. Well, it's based in Europe, right? And I say based, not strong, because I think that there is a real tension between putting degrowth as the goal of the shift, as opposed to something like, buen vivir or well-being, like another measure of what we're trying to do as a civilization, right? Because I think that if we just because we understand that pursuing short-term growth is the problem, that doesn't necessarily mean that degrowth is the solution. And I think that particularly at a time of a relentless austerity, when people hear, well, this is what we need, degrowth, and they already feel that they're losing everything, and then it's immediately sort of shuts down the conversation. And the truth is that there are things that we need more of, we need to expand, and so we need to contract those parts of our economy that are extractive, and we need to expand those parts of our economy that will allow us to take care of each other in particular, as we face this rockier future that we've made inevitable. So that would just be a kind of a warning against just kind of flipping the switch from growth to degrowth, because I definitely share the critique, but I don't share the foregrounding of degrowth as what we're trying to do. I think we're trying to do something. I think we're trying to build a society that is based on principles of respect for life and regeneration, which is why I like the idea of a regenerative economy.
Great. Well, thank you. I don't want to follow up, but there's a book that was written by a Vermonter, Tom Wessels, called The Myth of Progress, which is a real good critique of our economic progress in terms of the third law of thermodynamics and entropy. It's a great read, and I would just suggest you find that book. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that recommendation. And you guys, I know we're going to be cut off soon, so I would just want to say what I didn't say at the beginning, which is it's really exciting to me how many reading groups have emerged in Vermont, and this amazing sort of self-organizing that's going on, and also just how Vermont has led the climate justice movement in so many ways, and also it just is a place where such bold thinking and acting is taking place around the right to universal health care, and this is a state where bold ideas can get put into practice. And I mentioned that meeting that we're having in Canada, where it's driven by the fact that we need this coalition. We've got a very right-wing government, and we need this shift. It's a naturally progressive country. It's also just kind of a more manageable place where we feel like we can create something that would be a useful starting point for others to build these types of coalitions. And I think Vermont falls into that same category. Like, I think because you have such strong social and economic justice movements, as well as such a strong climate movement, you've got amazing theorists like Joshua Farley, in the state, and many others, working in the policy realm. I think it would be really exciting if you guys did something similar that could be used by other states, and showed what that coalition would look like and what those principles would look like. I just want to thank you for your bold vision and bold leadership.
Great.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for taking the time to talk with us. This has been wonderful.
Look, she may not have heard you.
Great. And I'm sure you guys are going to continue talking after I check out. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.